here tonight because tonight we're going to roast George to the coals. It's going to be so much fun. Our first special speaker is an actor who's been in so many films, almost as many films as George Huff has ideas in a single day. He's a good friend of all of yours, I'm sure. You'll welcome him now, please, James Stewart.
Good evening. I'm real glad to be here. I met George back in 1965. We were in South Africa. And George had this great invention for a new game. It was this plastic hoop. And you put it around your waist, and you kind of wiggled from side to side, and the hoop would go round and round and round. I never saw much significance in it, but George did. In fact, the reason we were in South Africa was because George wanted to try it out on a group of natives. This was the Bula tribe. And you see, if the Bulas liked it, he'd call it the Bula hoop. Anyway, you see, while we were down there, George and I, we went on this expedition, and we were going to go to this lake. It's a Lake Baringo. It's supposed to be one of the most beautiful lakes in the world. You know, and it was no easy matter getting there. We had to get in a four-wheel drive Jeep, and we took off down the road, and it was a long trip. And George and I were in this Jeep for about 4 hours. And George said to the driver, do you think we could get there a little quicker? That was his first mistake. The driver, he turned off the road, and he started going off into the bush. There was no road anywhere. And he was going straight toward this mountain, and then he got to the edge of the mountain, and he started to go straight up. I mean, straight up. And then George and I were holding on for dear life and everything like that, and it still took 8 hours. And we finally got to the top of the hill, and sure enough, here was this beautiful lake, and it was gorgeous. I mean, it was smooth, and the birds were chirping, and it was really beautiful. And George, I wrote this poem about the trip. Would you mind if I read the poem? Thank you. Lake Baringo is a body of water, and its surface is smooth as glass. But getting there with George Huff is a genuine pain in the ass. Thank you.
I'd like to invite up an old friend of George's who was totally humiliated today when his son Sean beat the pants off him in a tennis tournament. You all know him as Dick Venencia. Come on up, Dick. Have some fun.
Oh. I've been waiting for this for a long time. The last time I had an opportunity was when George turned 40, and that was about 20 years ago. And that time Anita wrote probably one of the greatest poems about George, and I wish we had that tonight. This was kind of impromptu, but I put together some notes here, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about George Huff and my relationship with him. We have a wonderful and strange relationship. I'm wonderful and he's strange. Well, George and I have been business partners for 19 years, and really a kind of an unholy alliance, and kind of unholy because you got a German and an Italian. And I just followed his advice. You know, he's got to sign up in his office. You know, let's be reasonable and do it my way. So I kind of adhere to what the chairman wants, and I kind of follow his leadership. So I let him think that he's doing it his way. But I really get a kick out of George. You know, he's very, very neat, and it's kind of his West Point background. And when you stay with George, like I go up to Nevada because San Jose is about 2.5 hours away. When George goes to bed at night, he takes all of his clothes and he kind of cleans them off. You know, he spit polishes his shoes, gets everything ready. And it's a kick in the tail because you might be sitting there reading the newspaper and you go to the bathroom and before you know it, all the newspaper is nice and clean. And in fact, I think he goes out and resells the newspaper. But in the morning you go in to get some cereal and all the cereal is lined up in a row that's dressed right. You got your Raisin Bran here, and you have your granola there, and you know everything's. And nobody would dare to have a granola out of place. And I remember one night I got out of bed to go to the bathroom at 3 in the morning, and when I came back, my bed was made. I mean, the guy's unbelievable, and you know he roomed for a long time at Chris Haggerty, and that's Austrian feeling because you know Chris has got signs in the morning. You know he says his little prayers on his mirror and over here he's got, you know, signs, remind me to call, you know, so-and-so, and George, you know, everything's in his head. George gets up in the morning and it's showtime, you know, he gets in front of the mirror, and then he transforms himself into General Patton. He said, I'm going to go out and get those son of a bitches. The first thing he does, he shows up for his first staff meeting at 5 o'clock in the morning. Well, you know, everybody's standing at attention. You go in there and George walks in the room, relax, at ease. And he sits in there and he looks at John Buckley and said, well, John, your task today is to go out in the Russian front, and I want you over there to take care of what's going on in that problem area. And Venezia, you go down and handle the Italians, okay? You kind of take care of that front. And Gisela, you're going to take care of the Balkans this week. And so he does a real good job delegating. And then the other day, George had an agenda, and it was about a 5-page agenda, and he made the mistake by showing up late for the meeting. And when he showed up, I guess you were about 20 minutes late. We had 95% of the agenda done. And we do a pretty good job without you, George, but we love having you around. Well, George, somebody commented, I heard somebody say that George is getting a little bit obese, and he has a couple of bestsellers out. One is, you know, the so-called seafood diet. George eats everything he sees. And he's written the sequel to that, and it's called, you know, The Light Diet. He starts eating as soon as it becomes light. But unfortunately, I really think George Huff, who purports to be a German, is really part Chinese because he's got more chins than a Chinese phone book. Well, it's fun and games, George. I know I'm going to get even someday, or you're going to get even. One of the things that George really does a good job on, and that's creating new companies. You ever see a GFA organizational chart? No. He's modified it. It's now down. It's Xerox paper times 20. But we call it the Entityville Horror Chart. The other thing he does well, you ever ask George about his family? Does anybody know his family background? You know, well, he's got 3 mothers, he's got 4 stepfathers, he's got 8 stepbrothers and sisters, he's got 4 kids that are known. And I keep saying to George, you know, your family tree resembles a shrub. It goes this way. Now, he's very, very creative, and one of the creative things that he does, he gets up in the morning and when it's showtime, and he tries to figure out how many mouths he has to feed that day, and he can't fire any of the people in his family. So George is very motivated to create a very, very handsome and profitable company. We love you, George. I had a good even. I do not apologize. Thank you.
Oh, God, Dick, you were great. God, I loved every minute of it. Our next speaker is a professional announcer for sports. He's been seen on ABC's Monday Night Football for years, and he finally gave up the job. I would like to introduce to you now Howard Cosell.
It
was the fall of 1952. A mild-mannered genius was quarterbacking the Army team from Annapolis. Oh, from West Point, excuse me. Quarterback, George Huff, the quintessential embodiment of athletic prowess. The man was a rock. His low center of gravity led the Army squad to its finest season in 20 years. Truly a remarkable task. Today, a mere shadow of his former self, George continues to win victories on the field of play. But today, the field of play isn't the gridiron of yesteryear. Today, George wins his victories in the arena of the American singles bar. Some say George invented the singles bar. Others are sure that he's the uncrowned king. George's dexterity of wit and wisdom in these establishments of sin brings an almost contemptuous envy from his male peers. The master of the one-liner, the architect of the one-night stand. George, a man wounded severely in 2 prior bouts with marriage, continues to forge ahead undaunted by his critics and friends. George has often been seen writing down the names of eager women from the finest men's room walls in the world. No one holds a candle to George's ability to make a date on a single telephone call. No single woman is safe from the omnipresent skills of this colorful, gentle man. George is an inspiration to all men of character and unbridled passion. George has told me many times his only regret is that he has but one body to give to the women of the world. George, I realized I was supposed to speak ill of you tonight, but I can find no fault with a man of such admirable quality. Thank you.
Oh, wasn't he right to the point? Our next speaker is a man you see on Saturday mornings. He helps my children a lot. He's my friend and yours, Mr. Rogers. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a lovely day in this beauty way, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Hello there, George. It's nice to see you. Do you all want to know why I wear sweaters every day? Because back when I was on a PBS station and I was very poor, George was on the same program. He was teaching people how to invest in sweaters for a profit. I'm still wearing the same sweater that George sold me that day. You know, George isn't the best on giving people advice. George told me because I was very poor that I should get on Medi-Cal. And Medi-Cal's not the best. I had an appendicitis, so I needed to go to a hospital. So I called Medi-Cal. They sent me to a hospital, Our Lady of Perpetual Negligence. I went in, I told them I needed a bed. They gave me a hammer and nails and told me I had to build it. My doctor's name was Sister Lefty. She had a black belt in theology. One arm she had a crucifix rolled up in her sleeve. On her other arm she had a tattoo of John the Baptist. When she flexed her muscles she could make his head roll off. George, my wife thanks you very much. You know, my wife had to see a gynecologist, and so we called Medi-Cal, and the appointment was on Saturday. I said, what gynecologist works on Saturday? She said, he's a part-time gynecologist. During the week, he's an auto mechanic. My wife went in, he flipped her up on blocks. Said, your reproductive organs are shot. You'll have to leave them in the shop overnight. You laughed. You should have seen the loner. The only problem is every once in a while during the winter, I've got a jump starter. The good thing I got a die-hard battery. Thank you, George, very much. Can you say gynecologist? Sure you can. Thank you very much. You know, our next guest is a very close friend of George. He works in Scottsdale, Arizona. He's a very special man. We'd like to bring him up right now. Alan Feldman.
We're here to talk about George Huff. I would like you all to open your Bibles to page 72, please. Now, I'm really not here to roast George Huff. How could I? George has always been my mentor, my teacher, my idol. I've been so fortunate to have a friend who would teach me how to sell Petro Lewis, Baldwin United, and Sunward. And then, because he wanted to do more for me, he allowed me to become a general partner in Apex Oil. We're very proud that George is a graduate of West Point, but then we all know what kind of kids get sent to military colleges. And then we sometimes forget that George really is a financial planner, and a very successful one. And he really can't miss. George can't miss being a successful financial planner because he has the two great attributes. He has gray hair and hemorrhoids. That's right, it's the gray hair that gives him the look of wisdom and the hemorrhoids the look of concern. I know that George really keeps his mind on work. Very few people keep their mind on work like George. Yesterday, he was out on the patio diligently writing something. And I went up to him and I said, George, did you see that dead bird? And he said, where? And I'm really proud of George. He has GFA research, FPEC, FPIC, FSA, USC, intermediate systems, AO&C, Unimark, Statesman's Life. The good news is that George is going to work this weekend. The bad news is we're going to have 2 more companies next Monday. George owns 3 homes, none of which he lives in. He has his own way of tax planning for his ex-wives. They complained they were paying too much taxes, so he just cut off their alimony. Yesterday, George was telling me how nice the hotel was to him and how great the room he has is. He said he just didn't understand why they wanted him to shave in bed. And I said, George, why do you think they want you to shave in bed? And he said, why else would they put a mirror over the bed? And then there was the time that George said if I could guess how many chickens he had in the bag, he'd give me both of them. I'll never forget George because he taught me, I didn't know much about counting, and he taught me about FIFO, LIFO, and FIST. I know you all know what FIFO is and LIFO is, but for George, FIST-in is first in, still there. George, I want you to know that you should be proud. I heard today at 4 o'clock that the Guinness Book of Records is considering entering you in there for the following record. In 64 seconds, George Huff came up with 474 ideas, none of which could possibly work. George, I'd really love to have you come up here so we could have a battle of wits, but you know I never fight anyone that's unarmed.
Geez, Alan, you were tough. Our next guest is a friend of the Pope's. He's a man who starred on television Saturday Night Live. He's a very funny man, very, very dedicated. My friend, Guido Sarducci.
Good evening. I'm so glad to be here. I got to tell you this. George is like the great benefactor to the Catholic Church. This man, when we were about to sell the Vatican, George came up with the greatest money-raising idea you have ever heard of. It was called Priest in a Box. It was truly brilliant. What it was a drive-through confessional. And you like a drive up and you see this like a little porcelain statue of a priest. You give your confession. You pay like a couple of little dollars for a donation. The priest says it to you, so many Hail Marys and Our Fathers, and then you get like a free discount coupon for any Wendy's. Wendy's had a reciprocal agreement where if you bought a Wendy's burger, you'd get the prayer on a bun. George wanted to call this like a Pope in a box, but the Pope thought it was like a too commercial, you know. So then George came up with the real cash flow a cow, the sacred cow, if you will. This was like the big winner. This was a way to service more people during the communion. It was called the Communomatic. Now what you did was you take the hosts that you normally get in a communion and you put them into this like a Communomatic. And then you spray everybody in the congregation. Hey, this way you don't have to leave your pew to get the communion, you know? It was like a brilliant idea. Now, you know the wine you normally get in a communion, if George doesn't drink it? You pour this into the Communomatic and you spray everybody in the congregation. This way, not only do you get the wine, but you get like a free baptism every time you come to church. It's a hell of an idea, George. The Pope wants me to thank you personally. And he wants to know, have you finished his disability policy yet? Thank you, George. We now break from this roast for a commercial message. John Cameron Swayze for Timex watches. We've attached this Timex watch to the crotch of the center of the Los Angeles Raiders. Look at the brutal punishment it's taking. Knees, elbows, thighs. A tongue? They're ripping the watch from his crotch now. Rip! Will the Timex watch keep on ticking? The Timex watch takes the kicking, takes us licking, and keeps on ticking. This is my dog Spot. You know why my dog Spot's so happy? Because my dog Spot has his own home video recorder. That's right, in the privacy of his own doghouse, he can see such fabulous videos as Gone with the Bone, War of the Pooper Scoopers, and When Chuck Wagons Collide. And if you order right now, you receive absolutely free with your order this triple X-rated version called Deep Poodle. So send $995.95 to P.O. Box 222 Street, Dedham, New York. That's 222 Street, Dedham, New York, and allow 6 to 18 years for delivery. You know, if you join the Boy Scouts, you might grow up to be in the movies.
You might grow up to be a monster in the monster movies.
You might grow up to build a monster in the monster movies. Or you might get the chance to screw 220 million Americans. But you never know.
You're traveling in a foreign country. Irate militants have taken you captive. What will you do? What will you do? American Express, hostage insurance. Don't leave for Rome without it. CARE, UNICEF, the United Way. These are all superb and excellent organizations that need your donations. But what about the thousands of sperm whales around the world starving for an education? Please, give generously to the United Whale College Fund. And remember, a 3,000-pound mind is a terrible thing to waste.
Our next speaker is going to be a man who George has known for a long time. In fact, the man who probably supported him for the first 20 years of his life. This man is Bob Cole from U.S. Agra. Bob, would you please join us?
Boy, is this fun. I can hardly wait, George. I've known George for a long, long time. I had the pleasure of taking over a company that he almost drove into oblivion. And it was, we couldn't bring it back. I'm sorry, George. We drove your stock all the way to the bottom. No, George, when I first met George, I'll never forget his West Point training and his military training. We had a little thing between us because I was an ex-Navy pilot, and of course he's from that place on the Hudson called West Point. And he impressed me with his great organizational talent. I'll never forget the first meeting we attended. And he sat up in front of a group like this, stood up, a group of salesmen, and he said, "Gentlemen, I have 4 points that I want to make. 4 very special points. Now, gentlemen, the first point." But you know, all of you here, I'm sure there's not a person here that can't recite the GFA philosophy by heart. Is there anybody here that can't? Do you know the company line? You know, I think Dick mentioned a little earlier about the organizational chart that George is so famous for. And some of us that know him a little bit more intimately know that George does not sleep very much. As a matter of fact, not at all. I think Howard Cosell had some of the reason that George doesn't sleep that much. But George spends his nights figuring up the organizational chart, which you've seen. Those of you in the home office have seen the greatest organizational chart in the world. And George, I'd like to present you with a special copy. We didn't have time to get it all framed like you would want it. And it's just a very, very small organizational chart. But let's just go and try. Thank you, George.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. Our next guest is a man who runs a talk show, kind of introspective show. Well, probably not introspective, but very different. It's called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. His name is Robin Leach.
Robin Leach from Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. George, for years we've been tracking you, and we thought of having you on our program. But we found 2 minor problems. George isn't rich or famous. Someday, George, we're hoping you will be. We've been looking for someone of your caliber, but we just can't find them. We're hoping that all of you will have an opportunity to live the lifestyle of the rich and famous. Thank you.
Our next guest is a former president of the United States, of which most of you have probably forgotten him. But I will bring him on now. Former President of the United States, Jimmy Carter.
Hi there. How the hell are you? You may remember me. I used to be President of the United States. Back when there was Afghanistan, Iran, and Rosalind. Not to mention my mother Lillian, my brother Billy, and my daughter Atomic Amy. She's in jail now. We're trying to raise money for her release. But you remember a problem my brother got into with the Libyan? Billy got a little debt going with the Libyan, so we asked George for help. George suggested that we sell vacuum cleaners door to door. So we did. George told us exactly how to do it. I'd knock on the door, Mrs. Jones would open it, and Billy'd throw up. Then I'd come along and say, Mrs. Jones, how'd y'all like me to clean that up for you? She said, sure. We made just enough money to pay back the debt, and then Ronald Reagan, of course, paid the interest. George, we want to thank you very much. Thank you.
Our next friend is someone who wanted to be president but thinks it's probably a dangerous occupation. A senator whose name goes without any need for introduction. Your friend is...
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to be here tonight. As you know, I ran into some problems early on in my political career. I had a small problem where I was driving one night and I drove off a bridge and a woman kind of died. I was in real trouble, so I called George Huff. If you want a man with an idea, George is the man. George suggested that I start a school to help people to deal with problems like this. So I started the Ted Kennedy Underwater Rescue School. Learn how to save yourself from a drowning vehicle, how not to report it for 24 hours, how not to be prosecuted for the death of your passenger, and how to still be eligible to run for president. That's a $9.95 value. Graduates receive a badge with a picture of me, Ted Kennedy, wearing a snorkel saying, I tried. George, I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you.
Our next speaker, our second to the last speaker, is a man who also was a big man in politics. You might remember him, Richard Milhous Nixon.
Good evening, and welcome to the George Huff Roast. I want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. I mean, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I was in some serious trouble. I needed to help improve diplomatic relations with the Chinese. So I came to George. George said, send them ping-pong balls and you can't lose. The rest is history. I was thinking of another line of work, and I said, George, what should I do? And George said, start a delicatessen. So I started Dick's Deli. We've got a J. Gordon Liddy liver burger, a Dean Diver sandwich, a Warren burger with Archibald cock sauce, and a Dick Nixon burger, George's favorite, with no burger at all, just the cover-up. George even wrote the slogan, remember, at Dick's Deli, we're not crooks, we're cooks. Thank you.
Our last speaker, someone you're all very happy with, I'm sure. This man is a legend in his own mind. He's also the current President of the United States. Please help me welcome Ronald Reagan. Well, there you go again, George. I was having a fine time of everything, and then you had to propose tax reform. In fact, George wrote it on a napkin back in fall of last year and sent it to Senator Bob Packwood. Then carbon copied me. Well,
if any of you are going to be distressed with tax reform, there's the man responsible. No, just kidding, George. You know, that reminds me of a little story. Once upon a time in a land far, far away, let's call that land America, there was a little blue choo-choo train. For you ladies in the audience, it was a little pink choo-choo train. That little train had to get over a big hill. Let's call that Capitol Hill. This train was carrying all kinds of toys and gifts for the little boys and girls. Let's call those toys and gifts tax reform. Well, the way it went, this little train, this little blue choo-choo train, started up this hill, and it ran into a big, tall, mean ogre. Let's call that ogre special interest groups. Now that engine had two choices. It could either say, I can't, I'm not going to, or, like George would say, I think I can. And sure enough, that little blue engine powered up and ran right over that mean old son of a bitch ogre. And down the other side, into the land of America. Well, as you all know, the rest is history. This is a time when I would like to say that I think George deserves a reward, because George is that little blue engine that said, I think I can, I think I can. And I'm proud to know a man, a real man, who always said, I thought I could, I thought I could. Thank you, George Huff. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight.
Thank you very much.